So going over the last part of the endocrine system, so this is going to focus on the pancreas. The pancreas is going to be kind of a long triangular gland, so it's going to go kind of horizontally, and it's partially behind the stomach, and it sits around the small intestine too. So you'll see small intestine wrapping around. The pancreas is different in the fact that it's what we call an exocrine gland, so it does have areas with ducts and secretions go through the ducts. And the endocrine, which again, no ducts, right into the bloodstream. The exocrine function we're going to talk about later when we get to the digestive system. The endocrine function is what we're talking about now. So the exocrine is going to be digestive enzymes that's going to go into a duct and then goes into the small intestine. So again, we'll talk about that later. When we have the areas of endocrine cells, it's actually called pancreatic islets. So when you look at the pancreas, there's going to be just kind of little islands of where the hormones are going to be produced by the pancreas and released into the bloodstream. And within these little islands, there's going to be different types of cells that produce different hormones. So there's multiple different hormones that are produced by the pancreas. The most famous of them all is insulin. Insulin's produced by what we call beta cells. So beta is insulin. Glucagon opposes insulin, mentioned it in previous videos, and that's produced by alpha cells. So you'll again have an alpha cell, a beta cell, all in kind of this area. Delta cells are going to be ones that produce somatostatin, which actually stop both insulin and glucagon from working when we need it to be. So if you aren't rising your blood glucose and you're not decreasing your blood glucose, that's because of somatin. F cells, I don't know, I went alpha, beta, delta, F, but F cells secrete pancreatic polypeptide. So again, a chain of amino acids. And this is going to kind of stop everything for digestion. It's going to inhibit somatostatin. So it's going to have an effect on that. It's going to stop gallbladder contraction, which is going to use for fat digestion when we get there. So we'll talk about the gallbladder more then. And secretion of pancreatic enzymes, which is going to be digestion as well. So basically, pancreatic polypeptides stops digestion. So for whatever reason, you don't need to work on digestion or your sympathetic nervous system's kicked in and you release this. So then you're not going to work on digestion, but you're also not going to inhibit glucagon and insulin that are controlling your blood glucose by themselves without digestion. So again, pink-lighted islet cells, this is just kind of a picture of it. So this is going to be cells that are making digestive enzymes. They have a duct in the middle, so that's where it's going to go. We have delta cells, pancreatic polypeptide cells, which are going to be F. And then we'll have alpha cells and beta cells in here. So alpha cells, glucagon. Remember, kind of glucagon has an A for alpha. Beta cells, so these are the alpha cells and beta cells. So alpha is making glucagon, beta is making insulin. It's the other one. So beta cells is insulin. Delta cells, again, is going to produce somatostatin. That's going to suppress the release of glucagon and insulin. It also helps kind of with digestion as well. So it's going to slow down food absorption. So you're going to have kind of less nutrients being absorbed and less enzymes being released in your intestinal tract. So this is kind of focusing on kind of slowing digestion. You need to focus on other things that are going on in your body. So that's when somatostatin is going to be released. F cells, again, is a pancreatic polypeptide. It's going to inhibit kind of digestion as well. So it's going to stop pancreatic enzymes. It's going to inhibit contraction of the gallbladder, which is for lipid digestion, which again, we'll talk more about when we get to the digestive system. And then nutrient absorption, kind of controlling that rate. So F cells, the pancreatic polypeptide, and somatostatin is more controlling digestion with its hormones. So this is just again looking at the pancreas. So this is why I say it's kind of a weird triangle shape, but it hangs out. This is going to be the duodenum, which is the beginning of the small intestine. We'll learn more about that later. And then kind of hiding behind the stomach and going around, kind of hugged by the small intestine. So this is just histologically what we're looking at of the different types of cells, of all alpha cells producing glucagon, beta cells producing insulin. So the two major hormones that we're going to talk about released by the pancreas, glucagon and insulin. So glucagon is what we call a hyperglycemic agent, meaning it's going to increase your blood glucose. So this means we want glucose circulating in the blood. This is released when you have low blood glucose levels. So again, it's homeostasis because you may have blood sugar where blood glucose you haven't eaten in a day. Well, why is it that you cannot eat in a day? You're not passing out and having symptoms of low blood glucose. Well, it's because of this hormone of glucagon. So if you have a low blood glucose, usually it's going to be less than 60. You don't need to memorize that. Then you're going to release glucagon and you are going to increase your blood glucose. Glucagon is also going to be released by the sympathetic nervous system, even when it's not necessarily low, because again, think about fight or flight. Everything that you're preparing for the sympathetic nervous system is going to be you're preparing your muscles where you're going to need a lot of glucose and oxygen to make energy, to make ATP to use in your muscles. So anytime you see kind of a hormone that's involved with the sympathetic nervous system, it's going to be increasing blood glucose so that you can use it. It can go to the muscles, especially, so that it can be used for energy to contract your muscles. So, how does glucagon raise your blood glucose levels when they're low? It's going to go to the liver. So, again, we hear glycogen. So, another way, if a hormone is going to increase your blood glucose, BG, then it's going to go to the liver, and glycogen is going to be broken down to glucose. So, remember glycogen, mentioned it before, storage molecule. We call this, the fancy term is glycogenolysis, lysis meaning breakdown, so breakdown of glycogen. You can also make glucose from lactic acid if it's around, from kind of anaerobic metabolism, and other non-carbohydrates. So the non-carbohydrates that we're talking about are lipids and amino acids. So we can use non-carb sources, so other sources in our body. Once we use up our storage, then we'll use lipids and we can convert it to glucose, and we can use proteins or amino acids from the proteins to convert it to glucose. And I've mentioned this term before as well, of Genesis is making, new, glucose, so making new sugar from lipids, amino acids, and lactic acids. So by breaking down glycogen, you release glucose into the bloodstream. If you're making new glucose and lipids amino acid breakdown, then you are releasing more glucose into the blood. So that's how, if whatever reason your blood sugar is low, then you're going to use your stores of fats, your store of protein, and your store of glycogen to increase that blood glucose. Insulin is going to be the opposite of glucagon, so they're antagonistic. Remember, they oppose each other. So glucagon, blood glucose goes up. Insulin, blood glucose goes down. So this is insulin is secreted after you eat. So when blood glucose levels are increasing, if glucagon goes too high, you can release insulin as well to oppose, but naturally, normally, it's going to be after eating. So how does it decrease our blood glucose? So this isn't saying the glucose isn't lost from your body. It just moves into cells. And if it's no longer in the bloodstream, well, then the blood glucose goes down. So it's moving from the capillaries into the cells. Glucose has to have insulin to allow major transport into the cell. So that's how blood glucose will go from the blood to the cell. So it was Bg, but now it's just in the cell G. It hasn't changed or lost, but it's no longer circulating in the bloodstream. So if you take a blood sample and you look at it, it's going to be lowered. So insulin is going to increase the transport. You need it to transport into muscle cells. It's going to be one place. And it enhances it. Not saying that glucose can't go inside the cells normally, but it's going to increase the transport. So instead of just a couple of times, it's going to go a whole host of times. It's going to make it more. It's also going to stop the breakdown of glycogen to glucose because we don't need more blood sugar. Or blood glucose, we're trying to decrease it. So it's going to inhibit glycogenolysis, which this is antagonizing of what happens with glucagon, complete opposite of what happens with glucagon. It's also going to stop amino acids and fats to be transferred or changed into glucose. So it's going to inhibit the gluconeogenesis. Again, complete opposite of what's happening with the glucagon because we're trying to lower our blood glucose. So we don't need more. We have enough. We want to push it into the cells so it can be used for energy, but we don't need to increase it anymore. Insulin doesn't increase the glucose uptake in the liver, the kidney, or the brain. So they can always take as much glucose as they want because they always need it. Liver's going to store it, kidneys always using ATP and energy, and your nervous system only uses glucose for energy. You can't use fats or amino acids, so it's always going to have a large amount of glucose uptake in the cells there. Insulin also is important. That's why I'm going to make sure it's important with actual development of neurons. It can be involved in learning and memory as well. But the major thing is, what does insulin also do? So this is talking about the cells. So again, helping blood glucose decrease by glucose going into the cell. Well, glucose is important of making ATP. You need glucose and oxygen to make ATP. So cells are going to use this glucose to make energy. If you are in, that should be form. If you are in the muscle or the liver where glycogen is, you're actually going to store glycogen. So with glucagon, you're breaking down glycogen. In insulin, you make glycogen. So you're taking any excess glucose that you not need to make ATP and energy, and you are going to store it for later. So you'll make glycogen with the glucose. Then we talked about with glucagon, fat being changed to glucose to be used for energy. The opposite can happen as well. So glucose is going to change to fat, which is another storage, energy storage component. So we fill our glycogen and then we fill our fat storage. So in adipose tissue, especially, this is going to be where glucose is actually changed to fat and stored in our adipose tissue in case we need it. So then glucagon comes along because we have low blood sugar and low blood glucose, and then we can change it, break down the fat and change it to glucose when needed. So insulin release, the primary is just your blood glucose level is high. So blood glucose level is high, insulin's going to decrease it. That's the point. You can also see stimulation of increased fatty acids and amino acids. So say if you eat a meal that's high in fat and protein. So meal high in fat and protein. You not necessarily increasing your blood glucose immediately, but you do have where you've eaten and you may need to store the fat, so store it. May need to kind of increase production of proteins as well. So meal with just amino acids and fatty acids will increase your insulin. Not as much as eating ice cream, but it's still going to increase it. Also, the neurotransmitter that you learned about with the muscles mainly, nervous system, is acetylcholine, and that's the major parasympathetic neurotransmitter as well. So remember parasympathetic pair of sweatpants? So that is your rest and digest. So if we're just eating and you are digesting, then, or you're resting and now you can digest your meal that you had a couple hours ago, well, then you can increase your insulin as well. Sympathetic nervous system, you're not going to worry about digesting because you're either fighting or running. And then somatostatin that we talked about, released by the pancreas, is going to inhibit release of insulin as well. So just looking at homeostasis, normal blood glucose levels are 70 to 110-ish. So if you have a rising blood glucose levels, then you're going to release insulin from those beta cells. Then you're going to increase glucose moving into the cells. You're going to increase the rate of glucose being used to make ATP. You're going to change glucose, anything that you have left over that's not made into ATP. You're going to transform it to glycogen and store it. You're going to increase your amino acid absorption, and you're going to actually increase protein synthesis. So again, that's why if you have a meal high in fat and protein, you still release insulin, just not as much. And so then you also increase your triglyceride synthesis in fat tissue. And then that all decreases your blood glucose levels because it's all being utilized in the tissues in the cells and it's no longer in the blood. If you have low blood glucose levels, the alpha cells are going to secrete glucagon. That's pretty much all the opposite of what we just said with insulin. So you're going to break down your glycogen to glucose in liver and skeletal muscle. That's where glycogen is. So you're going to release glucose into the bloodstream. You're going to break down fat to fatty acids and transform it to glucose. You're going to increase the release of glucose. So fatty acids transform to glucose and amino acids transform to glucose happens in the liver. So gluconeogenesis is going to happen in the liver, and you're going to increase the release of glucose, all causing the blood glucose levels to increase. So you can watch that anytime.